Outstanding. Thank you, Ro. So I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Rik Wanninkhof, who is a senior scientist at NOAA's Atlantic Oceanographic and Meteorological Laboratory. He's in the Ocean Chemistry Division, located out of Key Biscayne, Florida. He serves as our lead federal investigator for ocean acidification on the East Coast. He was the chief scientist aboard several large-scale geochemical research surveys, including GOMEC, which I believe we heard from Alec in the previous talk, part of this session. And he oversees a great deal of the volunteer observing ship and autonomous underway CO2 observations throughout the region, and also serves as a key scientist for overseeing our analytical capabilities related to carbon chemistry on the East Coast. So I'm hoping today Rik's going to lay out where we stand with regards to our understanding of ocean acidification along the East Coast region. Again, this is part of that first thematic area where we're looking primarily at the large-scale oceanographic changes in response to ocean acidification, and later on we're going to start moving up into the much more dynamic coastal acidification aspects, although they do tend to interact with it. So, Rik, I'll hand it off to you.
All right. Thank you for the nice introduction, Dwight. I should be able to take over the screen pretty soon now.
You're sharing your screen right now, Rik.
Okay, so I'll put it in presenter mode, and we're ready to go. Everybody can see it?
Yes, I can.
All right, very good. So today I'll be discussing ocean acidification along the eastern Gulf Coast of the USA, and sort of a sub-theme is that I like to sort of emphasize is the regional applications of large-scale observations, how it sort of fits into the NECAN NERACOS framework. And before I start, I want to sort of give a general idea of where I feel we stand with ocean acidification research and what our role is that what you'll hear today is mostly a discussion of physical and chemical forcing of ocean acidification. This leads to, we believe, a biological response, which is largely negative. And what you basically get is you'll get a negative stakeholder response. Although we should not shoot the messenger, or in this case stab the messenger, that's often the case. So what I also would like to highlight today somewhat is this idea that besides just giving negative information or negative news about the state of the ocean and ocean acidification, that we actually are working on producing products to be able to do what we call nowcasts and forecasts, which we hope will facilitate adaptation and mitigation strategies and lead to happy oysters and then happy fishermen. And that's, of course, our ultimate goal in life, is to keep the fishermen happy. So in an outline is, you'll probably have heard it from Alex and Helmut, but I'll sort of, again, sort of remind you on the very basics on what is ocean acidification, how do we measure ocean acidification, then what are the large-scale patterns of ocean acidification along the East Coast and Gulf Coast, then the issue of what are we seeing at the near shore, what other factors are confounding ocean acidification in the coastal realm, and then finally, I'll finish up with how do we utilize these observation insights, and also the data streams which are currently obtained within the Northeast Regional Association to monitor ocean acidification in the region. So if we go to the basic definition, there are several definitions of ocean acidification. This one comes from the 4M Act. It is basically defined as a decrease in pH of the Earth's oceans and changes in ocean chemistry caused by chemical inputs from the atmosphere. And I think that's an important issue, is that most definitions of ocean acidification are basically referring to the inputs from the atmosphere, and then all the other processes are what I call confounding processes. We have a legislative driver for ocean acidification research in the USA, which is very cleverly called the 4M Act, the Federal Ocean Acidification Research and Monitoring Act. And its purpose of the 4M Act is to monitor and conduct research on the process and consequences of ocean acidification in marine organisms and ecosystems. Now, the legislative driver provides us resources to do this research, but our physical chemical driver is atmospheric CO2 increase. And the important part of this is that when the atmospheric CO2 increases, the ocean takes up a certain amount of CO2, which increases the CO2 levels within the ocean. And this can be seen in the following plot. On the left-hand side is the plot of atmospheric CO2 levels, which we've seen since the started Industrial Revolution, where we've seen a steadily increasing level of atmospheric CO2. And we're pretty certain that this level will continue to increase as we continue burning fossil fuels. The dashed line is an indication what the atmospheric CO2 levels would be if there wasn't uptake of carbon dioxide by the ocean. And so in that respect, the ocean is doing a huge service to the general society of sequestering CO2. This basically, if we look into the future, this is a right-hand panel, which comes from an IPCC report, which is where they have different scenarios. We basically can see that if we continue burning fossil fuels and increasing burning fossil fuels at the rate that we've been doing and the rate of change we're doing, we're going to see huge, huge changes within the next 200 years and actually within our lifetime. And the way I like to look at it is that for all of us, we'll see a bigger change in atmospheric CO2 than ever experienced by man. And this, as I mentioned, does have an impact on ocean CO2 levels. One of the ways that we look at the impact of ocean CO2 levels, and I'll go into it in more detail in the next slides, is a parameter which we call the aragonite saturation state. And I think the important thing is in the open ocean, we can, with high degree of confidence, if we know the atmospheric CO2 levels, we can predict from basic physical chemistry of the ocean what the surface water levels will look like. And we've got sophisticated models to do this. We can also do it on the back of the envelope. We'll get similar results. And essentially what we see is that over time, the ocean is taking up more CO2, decreasing the saturation state. And I think the take-home message of these global model outputs for the next 100 years is that at high latitudes, there are lower saturation states. And it's very important for the northeast region is that at the higher latitude, northeast will see lower saturation levels than the areas around where I live. And this is caused by the seawater is less covered at high latitudes. Then if you look closely, if you look at the NECANs region, the northeast region, you actually see that there is no color. It's basically blank, and it doesn't mean that there is no oceanification happening in the coastal areas, but it is that global models do not forecast trends in the coastal ocean. I think it's a very important point, and the coastal ocean will see a general trend as we see globally, but there are some very unique situations in the coastal ocean, which I'll talk about in the near slides. Next slide. Now let's go to the basic chemistry slide that every ocean acidification talk has. This is basically what happens when the excess CO2 in the atmosphere from fossil fuel burning ends up in the ocean. And you can express it in a lot of different chemical carbon equations. I like to express it in 3. When the CO2 enters the ocean, you have a reversible reaction where most of the CO2 reacts with water, forms the hydrogen ion, which is the ocean acidification part, plus bicarbonate. Now, the thing that is often sort of forgotten, particularly when we think about ocean acidification, is that most of this hydrogen ion is basically reacts immediately with a carbonate ion, which is naturally in the ocean, forms more bicarbonate. If we think of our basic high school chemistry, we can combine these two equations, and we can do it in terms of calcium carbonate. And what you can see is that you add CO2 to calcium carbonate, and you basically dissolve the calcium carbonate. And this is one of sort of the extreme reactions that can happen at high enough CO2 levels. Now, the thought experiment, which I like to do to sort of express how this speciation occurs, is let's think of a situation, and this is a situation in the subtropical area where 100,000 CO2 molecules are entering the ocean. What happens to these CO2 molecules? So on average, about 7,000 basically remain happily swimming around the ocean as carbon dioxide. Then what we see is that we get a huge change of bicarbonate. Actually, more bicarbonate is formed than CO2 enters the ocean, and this is because this second reaction in the box above is basically that you get the carbonate ion reacts with the hydrogen ion, which is released during the acidification reactions, and we see a decrease in carbonate ion. And really the thing that I kind of like to emphasize is that there is a very small net change in actual pH in the water compared to the number of CO2 molecules that enter. Now, each of these chemical species is believed to have a different effect on biota. And so for CO2, there is a general belief that increased level of CO2 has a detrimental effect on cell physiology. There is conflicting evidence, but there is some results suggest that the increase in bicarbonate has a slight positive effect on the basic photosynthesis reactions within the ocean, where you have light plus carbon forms life. We know, and we've got a lot of evidence, that the large decrease in carbonate ion due to CO2 invasion has a negative effect on calcification. That seems to be sort of universally believed. And then the small change in hydrogen ion could have a negative effect on cells and calcification as well. But that's, again, that evidence is less firm. Now, what we sort of decided within the community is that we really need a bulk indicator of ocean acidification. And the bulk indicator, what we often use, and I'll use throughout this talk, is a parameter called aragonite saturation state, which is basically, you can look at it as an indicator of the amount of carbonate ions in the water and multiplied by the calcium ions, which have a very high concentration, divided by the solubility product. And I won't go into great detail on there's quite a bit of physical chemistry behind this saturation state and how the saturation state varies with temperature and pressure. But from a chemist's view, there's one number which is important, which is the saturation state of 1. If you have less than 1, basically the mineral phase aragonite is unstable thermodynamically, and the mineral will dissolve. If it's greater than 1, it will not dissolve. Now, the biologists have a bit more nuanced view of saturation state, and I think this is important to remember as well. Although a lot of us are focused on this magical saturation state of 1, it is essentially that any change in aragonite saturation state has a negative effect on calcifying organisms, which is an extremely important point. Is that we don't really, we can't wait till the saturation state in the ocean turns less than 1 to see dramatic negative effects of ocean acidification. In cartoon form, this plot kind of shows, gives you some idea of the levels of the saturation state in the ocean. It generally ranges from about 5 to 0 when you have really undersaturated waters. And we also see that different areas of the ocean, like you saw on that global plot, have different sort of characteristic saturation states. And based on our measurements on our coastal cruises, and also, primarily from the coastal moorings, we have a good indication of sort of the range and average values of saturation states in the coastal realm that we are interested in along the East Coast and Gulf Coast. Along the Gulf Coast, there are relatively high saturation states and a fairly large range in sort of a very comfortable level of 3 to 5. The South Atlantic bight, we see still a very large range due to changes in temperature and salinity in the seawater and the carbon chemistry, but slightly lower on average. Then the Syracuse region has very low saturation range and also fairly low saturation levels and fairly narrow range based on the Syracuse mooring off New Hampshire. Now, what I've done on the right-hand side, so basically what is happening is with increasing CO2 levels in the ocean, we see that the ocean is decreasing its calcium or its aragonitic saturation state. The threshold, the thermodynamic threshold, is one which is listed down below here. But there are also other thresholds which are important to recognize, and these are the thresholds where the production equals the destruction. You need basically more production because there's a lot of natural other mechanisms that will decrease the calcifiers. For the subtropics, and particularly in corals, it's believed that the threshold is about 2.5 for aragonite saturation state before things get, go downhill very dramatically. And then for the subpolar region, the threshold is about, we believe, about 1.5. This depends somewhat on environment and also to a great extent on the species. But nonetheless, the important take-home message is that all decreases are detrimental for calcifying organisms everywhere, and that there are thresholds which differ based on location and based on species. Now, this is my last sort of future slide. This is a two-dimensional plot of the nice global picture, and this is done sort of, back of the envelope calculation, but this is what we expect to see for two sort of typical realms along the eastern Gulf Coast, is that in the subtropical warm waters, on average, for summertime conditions, the surface waters have a saturation state of aragonite of about 4, and it will decrease over time with increasing CO2 levels. We are very certain of that. Also, what we see at higher latitudes, like Syracuse region, we basically have an average saturation state of about 2.5. Remember the previous plot, there is a huge seasonal range in there as well. But on average, we'll see a decrease, which is not quite as great as the warmer waters, but we are closer to critical levels, so it is of great concern what's going to happen in the future. Now, NOAA has been charged within the 4M Act to basically, observe the changes in ocean acidification along the coastal U.S. and U.S. interests. And what we have done is we basically have started a program of trying to set up a observing system along the East Coast and Gulf Coast, which has basically three components to it. One is, we see on the top, is the moorings. We have currently, the Ocean Acidification Program of NOAA sponsors 3 mooring sites, one in off the mouth of the Mississippi, one in the South Atlantic Bight, and then the one in the Syracuse region, which is maintained by Joe Salisbury and Doug Vandermark at the University of New Hampshire. Then a second aspect is we have systems to measure surface water CO2 levels on ships of opportunity, and the map here is the 2 ships that are funded by the Ocean Acidification Program, which are NOAA fishery ships. One which spends most of its time in the Gulf of Mexico, and then one which is basically spending the Henry Bigelow, which is spending its time in the Northeast region. Then the third aspect are these process study cruises, which we do periodically. We've done 2 so far, which span the entire realm. And the one thing that these are funded by the NOAA Ocean Acidification Program, but we have a lot of other resources available, and I'm just showing as an example, we have both sponsored by other aspects of NOAA and then international and national partners. We have a huge network of ship of opportunity where we basically get surface water CO2 measurements, and that's shown on the main panel. Now, based on our GOMEC cruises, which is the acronym for Gulf of Mexico East Coast Carbon Cruises, we can get a somewhat zoomed-in snapshot of the continental scale saturation states. And this is basically a contour plot of the results of the cruise we did a year and a half ago, during where we basically went from the Mississippi outflow up into the Northeast region, and this is our calculated saturation states. For all these plots, I'm showing a lot of contour plots in the next several slides. Please remember that the only place where we have data are the points, black dots. And so everything which is far removed from that would look very strange, which might be, just a contouring artifact. But nonetheless, what we can see, there are two important things which you can see. The thing which I brought up earlier, that the lower latitudes have significantly higher saturation states than the higher latitudes, including the Syracuse region. And the second point, which is very important for the coastal work, is that if we look at all these transects, except the one off the Mississippi, we see a gradient going near shore, that the saturation states are lower near shore by a magnitude of 0.5 to 1 when we go. And we see that everywhere where we see it. And the gradients actually are greatest when we get into the northeast. Another way of looking at it is, since these cruises also have subsurface measurements, we can get an idea of how far these acidic waters with low saturation states, how far they go, how close they are to the surface. And there we see a second issue, which is confounding the issues of ocean acidification in the northeast, is that while in the here I've basically plotted a saturation level of 2. And in the Gulf of Mexico, this saturation level is at about 300 meters. When we go along the east coast, we see a really, really rapid shoaling towards the coast, but very, very deep saturation states over 700 meters, saturation state of 2 over 700 meters when we get offshore, and then a very strong gradient inshore. Then we get into the northeast region, and we see these low saturation states, so acidified water, very close to the surface. So basically we have two issues. We have low levels at the surface and low levels below the surface, which basically means that there is it's essentially there's no offshore savior for the saturation levels. I'll briefly emphasize the processes which are responsible for these lower saturation states in the northeast. And I've got a whole bunch of plots here, I'll basically show 3 transects in the northeast. And I just want you to focus on the plot which has a red circle around it, which basically shows the saturation states plotted against depth, which is 200 meters, and in this case, longitude. And this is a plot of the transect which we did during the GOMEC 2 cruise in the northeast. It is on the map on the left-hand bottom. You see the area which is contoured, surrounded with a red box, which is one of the ways you do it with Ocean Data View. And the take-home message for this particular transect, and I'll show 3 transects which have different reasons for changing saturation state levels, is that on this northernmost transect we see very low saturation levels at depth and a very strong shoaling towards the coast. And we see that all along, and this is one of the reasons why the coastal waters will have lower saturation states, is basically that the saturation state isoplasts follow general density structures and shallowing towards the coast. The second transect, which is often referred to as line W, which was maintained for I think well over 100 years by Woods Hole. When the Woods Hole scientists in the wintertime wanted to spend time in Bermuda, they basically on the way to Bermuda did transects. So we have a lot of historical data of hydrography, but we've occupied this as part of the GOMEC exercise. And we see, this is a bit further south, and we see, again, for all the transects, we see the shallowing of the isoplasts, but there is an added phenomena, which we see right towards the coast. We see very low saturation state levels right near the coast. And this is believed to be a coastal jet of water which is originating from Canada. I always like to say, well, we basically send polluted air to Canada, and they return the favor by sending us acidified waters. But we see this coastal jet which goes along the coast, and it's very clear in this particular station W of low saturation state water, which is going southward. So that's the second confounding problem. Then the third is if we look at what we call the New Jersey Transect, and again the bottom map shows the transect highlighted, and there we see sort of besides the this coastal jet, we see a second phenomena. In basically, this is local and remote remineralization, which basically sits on the shelf water. And we know this is not just a physical feature, but also a biogeochemical feature by looking at the oxygen levels, which is right next to it. And we see the areas of very low saturation state also correspond with very low oxygen, which is an indication of remineralization. We also see, and the plot next to the map, that we still have this cold water of this coastal jet there as well. So basically, on this particular transect, we see two issues which have a significant impact. Then, which is harder to see, but I'll show it in the next slide a bit clearer, that the New Jersey Transect also sees continental freshwater outflow, and right towards the coast, we see a significant decrease in the saturation states, which is caused by freshwater influence. So these were just examples of the coastal processes that some people call enhance the ocean acidification phenomena on the coast compared to the open ocean or open coastal areas. Now, one of the important issues along the Gulf and East Coast is freshwater input and the influence on ocean acidification. I think probably Alec mentioned this as well, so I won't go into great detail. But what we see if we go but not all fresh water is equal, is that it depends on the constituency of the river water. And what we see if we plot the saturation state versus salinity, it's not expected thermodynamically to be linear, but it's based on this scale. It's approximately you can look at it as a linear phenomena. We see that in the northern Gulf, we see very little influence of salinity on saturation state. And this is because the Mississippi River it's a well-buffered system with a lot of alkalinity and a lot of total carbon. So it doesn't have a significant influence on the saturation state. When we go further up the coast, we basically have the Cape Hatteras line, the New Jersey line, the New Hampshire line. We see that the influence of salinity becomes stronger and stronger and decreasing, and this is basically that the further north you go, the more the water coming off the continent comes off granitic rock and is very low buffered. So it's essentially you're diluting it with essentially distilled water or close to distilled water, and that causes a decrease in the saturation state. Now we switch topics slightly and try to get a bit more quantitative with this idea of creating maps of saturation states in the different regions. And we basically have two steps in that. First, we have to determine the saturation state because we don't measure that. We basically determine it from measuring the inorganic carbon system parameters, and then specifically we have to measure two of the inorganic carbon system parameters in order to calculate the saturation state. And then the second step is that we basically want to use remote and in situ automated monitoring to interpolate between these high-quality observations. This is might be a bit more technical detail than the audience is ready for, but I'll explain it anyway. This is basically a plot of alkalinity versus total carbon, which are the two state parameters within the inorganic carbon system. And then the colors are the saturation states, where the reds are high saturation states and the blue are low saturation states. And the dots are the 1,500 sample points that we took during the GOMEC cruise. And what we see is we see a very wide spread of alkalinity and total CO2, where you basically see sort of a bowed area where and the very high saturation state values are surface waters in the Gulf of Mexico and subtropical regions of the East Coast. Then when we go further down this line, we go to the deeper waters, which have higher total CO2 and decreasing alkalinity. And then we see all these scatter plot down below, and this ends up being all the data points which are north of Cape Hatteras. So you basically are seeing that these data points fall well below the prediction, and this is the influence of the coastal area, and particularly the freshwater inputs. Now, we stumbled up on this, or at least I stumbled on it. It might have been well known by several, that we looked at two other parameters that we measured on the GOMAC cruise, and this is the partial pressure of carbon dioxide and the pH of the water. And commonly, basically, these two parameters are not good in combination to determine other carbon system parameters, but it actually works extremely well for determining saturation states. And that's basically shown if we compare the top and the bottom plot. The bottom plot shows the pH, which is actually measured on board at constant temperature, versus the PCO2, which is measured on board at constant temperature for the whole water column. And we see a very, very tight correlation. This is basically the same data as we see up above. Tight correlation along the full range of the GOMAC domain from surface to bottom. And also we see that the isoplasms of aragonite basically transect at equidistance at first, and they get wider. But you basically see a very regular fashion of decreasing saturation states, and basically with higher PCO2 and lower pH. And we're excited about this because of the measurements that we can do autonomously. It's basically the PCO2 and the pH, which are the two parameters which we are pretty close to actually measuring robustly without a high, skilled labor force. And so, we can get a lot of measurements. We can put them on moorings. It's important to recognize that one of the things is when we do the measurements autonomously on moorings of ships of opportunity, that we measure the temperature in situ, and so we will have to get a good understanding of the temperature dependence of both pH and PCO2, and even after probably a century of measurements, we still don't have that pinned down exactly. Now, the second step is, so we've got the carbon parameters which we have for the algorithm development. The second step is how do we basically interpolate the data. And this is a concept that we are starting to use, is that we recognize that it's very difficult to get an algorithm for the whole realm. And so we use the concept of biogeochemical provinces, and then use remotely and in situ observations in order to fine-tune this. So basically what we, basically the Biogeochemical Province concept, which is pretty old. It was, I think, Longhurst was the first to sort of, propose this for the global ocean, and then Eileen Hoffman did this nice job, probably others as well, to delineate the provinces for the East Coast. And the key is that each region has unique physical, biological, and chemical features along this coast. And there is a very nice paper that was published this year by Sergio Signorini and a lot of co-authors, where they basically use this concept and then a interpolation technique using a neural network system to determine what the sea air fluxes were in each of these realms. And so I'm sort of approaching the mapping of saturation states in a similar fashion. Before I get to our mapping exercise, I just want to highlight some of the work which was done in the Syracuse region by Salisbury, which sort of emphasizes this issue that we can get fairly strong correlations with saturation state and bulk physical parameters. And this is an example of which Joe and colleagues provided of the relationship between the saturation state and salinity in the Gulf of Maine, where we see very strong relationship with salinity, but we see significant seasonal changes. So it is, the take-home message from this is that salinity is a very important parameter to use in creating relationships with saturation state, but it's not the only parameter. In the bottom, this is again work by Joe Salisbury and colleagues. We show the strong relationship of saturation state and temperature at the NECANs buoy in the Gulf of Maine. But again, sort of emphasizing, we see the red is the temperature, the black is the saturation state, and we see close correspondence, but also indications that are sometimes significant differences. Again, indicating that it's not, we can't just use temperature or just salinity, that we have to use several parameters. Now, so what we have basically done is, and this is the first step at trying to get maps of saturation state in the NECANs region and beyond, and we utilize our extensive ship of opportunity efforts on the NOAA ship Bigelow. This is done in collaboration with colleagues at the Northeast Fisheries Center, in particular John Hare, where on the bottom panel it shows the ship tracks which we've occupied and have CO2 measurements, temperature and salinity measurements over the last 3 years since the start of the program. And it always helps to make the ship track kind of thick because it looks, the coverage looks pretty impressive. So what we have done is basically looked at how we can relate the aragonite saturation state to different physical and chemical parameters using the high-quality data from the GOMEC cruises in this region. And so on the top left panel, we first looked at how does the aragonite saturation state relate to, we create a relationship with the partial pressure of CO2 in the surface water, which we measure on the ship of opportunity. And then we look at using a second parameter, so we use basically create a relationship between the aragonite saturation state and a function of partial pressure of CO2 and salinity. And at the bottom panel, we have basically using 3 parameters which we obtain from the ship, partial pressure of CO2, salinity, and temperature. And what you can see is that all 3 parameters, using all 3 algorithms, we get sort of a general idea, but we get quite a bit more fidelity when we use more parameters. Also, the correlation coefficients of these algorithms are significantly higher when we use these 3 parameters. I think it's sort of worth noting is that particularly when we look at using 3 parameters, we see some very interesting structures which some of them we still have to validate, some of them we know are real from independent measurements. One is you can hardly see it, but it is this is the spring 2012 cruises from the Henry Bigelow. They went into the Chesapeake Bay. You can hardly see it, but there is very, very low saturation states in the bay, and we have independent measurements to prove that, and this algorithm picks us up very nicely. And also we see within using 3 parameters a significantly lower saturation state getting further north. Now what we have done is we have 3 years of data, and so the next plot shows our sort of initial results of these maps. For the 3 years, I've, for this presentation, just split it between spring and fall. There are also a lot of summer cruises, which I haven't plotted up. But sort of the take-home message on this particular plot is that we see a significant, we see the general features with a lot of fidelity of high saturation states in the south, low in the north. But then we see a lot of sort of fine-scale structure, and also we see this issue of the coastal influences, like when we get high in the north, we see very low saturation states during the spring of 2011, which we believe is, a influence of significant runoff of colder waters, either runoff or advection from the north. And some of these features, we see significant differences through the years. Is that this very cold feature, or this very low saturation state feature, which is in the spring of 2011, we don't see in 2012. In 2013, it has a different structure. So we basically have the ability with these algorithms to see the large-scale structure, but also get a lot of fine detail. Also, what we see quite nicely, and particularly in the spring of 2013, is this very strong gradient. We have the warm waters, which are going off the coast with high saturation states and significantly lower to hit. Then on the bottom 3 panels are the plots for the fall cruises. And we see a dramatic difference from the spring and first order with much higher saturation states in the fall. Then we see in the spring, and there are sort of two factors to it. One is the fall temperatures are significantly warmer and than the spring temperatures. The second issue is that we still see the effect of photosynthesis on the surface waters, that photosynthesis will drive down the CO2 and basically increase the saturation states in the surface water. We also see this very strong, expecting in fall, this very strong demarcation between sort of the southern and northern part of the Syracuse region, which is sort of, it's more or less this line W, where we see this split between significantly higher saturation states and lower saturation states, which particularly shows up very nicely in the fall of 2011. But we see hints of it, in the other panels as well. Now, I was asked to sort of have some take-home messages, and I think the important ones for sort of a general talk is that we can't fool ourselves. Is that ocean acidification is here to stay, and also unless we do dramatic changes in the way we live, it's going to worsen because the atmospheric CO2 levels are increasing dramatically, and the rate of increase is accelerating. So I think this is something we have to recognize, is that it's not a issue that's going to disappear very fast. The global ocean trends can be very well predicted from global atmospheric rise and some basic carbon chemistry of the surface ocean. The coastal oceans are a bit more tricky. The trends are impacted by coastal processes, and also for most of the coasts, the ocean acidification is generally more severe due to the phenomena that I outlined earlier on. We believe that aragonite saturation state is a good bulk integrative means to express ocean acidification. We have to recognize that there are different carbon species have different effects on different biota, but that we do believe that aragonite saturation state is a very good way to sort of express the ocean acidification phenomena. And then we hope that these regional maps that we are planning to make, not just for the northeast region, but along the whole coastal realm, will provide nowcasts and forecasts. And for forecasts, we of course have to use models, but this will inform stakeholders and hopefully lead to some meaningful mitigation and adaptation strategies. So thank you, and I appreciate the time that you've taken to listen to my presentation. And also I'd like to thank you for not hauling me up to the northeast, because on the bottom I've shown the weather forecast for Miami on the left and for the Syracuse region on the right, and I think I'd rather be in Miami right now. So thank you.